The fluorescent lights of the city hospital hummed a monotonous tune, a soundtrack to Marcus's weary drive home. He'd spent the last 12 hours in the operating room, a marathon of precision and focus that had left him drained but satisfied. The successful removal of a complex brain tumor had been a victory, a testament to years of dedicated training and unwavering commitment. He glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The faint lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, a stark contrast to the sharp precision of his usual demeanor. His dark skin, usually vibrant under the hospital's bright lights, appeared muted in the twilight. He sighed, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The hospital parking lot was mostly deserted at this hour. A few cars remained, their headlights casting long, skeletal shadows across the asphalt. The air hung heavy with the scent of exhaust fumes and the faint, sterile smell of antiseptic that clung to his clothes. He'd been looking forward to a quiet evening, a hot shower, and perhaps a chapter or two of his current book before sleep claimed him. He'd earned it. The image of the patient's relieved family, their faces etched with gratitude, still lingered in his mind, a warm glow against the chill of the late evening air. He parked his car, a sleek, silver sedan, in a designated spot near the exit. The automatic locks clicked shut, the sound echoing in the stillness of the lot. He reached for his briefcase, the leather cool against his fingertips. As he stepped out of the car, a figure emerged from the shadows of a nearby building, his silhouette stark against the dim lighting. It was David, the hospital's security guard, a man Marcus had seen around the premises but never interacted with. David was a large man, his frame imposing even from a distance. His uniform, usually crisp and neat, looked rumpled and slightly askew. "Hey you," David barked, his voice cutting through the quiet. The tone was aggressive, laced with an underlying hostility that made Marcus pause. He straightened, his hand instinctively moving towards his briefcase, a subtle gesture of self-preservation. "Yes," Marcus replied, his voice calm and measured, a practiced response honed from years of dealing with anxious patients and their families. He tried to maintain a neutral expression, but a flicker of unease crossed his face. Something about David's demeanor felt wrong, unsettling. "What are you doing here?" David demanded, his voice sharper now, edged with suspicion. He took a step closer, his shadow looming over Marcus. The casual observation turned into a pointed interrogation. Marcus felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his stomach. He wasn't sure why the security guard was addressing him so aggressively. He hadn't done anything wrong. He'd simply parked his car and was preparing to leave. "I work here," Marcus responded, his voice still even, attempting to diffuse the situation. He produced his hospital identification card, holding it up for David to see. David snatched the card, his fingers brushing against Marcus's. He examined it briefly, his gaze lingering on Marcus's photograph before returning it with a curt nod. But the aggression didn't dissipate. Instead, it seemed to intensify. "This ain't your usual hours," David said, his eyes narrowed, his tone dripping with suspicion. He stepped closer, his body language clearly indicating that he wasn't convinced. The casual questioning had morphed into a direct accusation. Marcus felt a surge of frustration. He was tired, and this unnecessary confrontation was adding to his already depleted energy. He tried to explain, "I was working late. There was a complicated surgery." David scoffed, his face hardening. "You right? You bet. What are you really doing here, boy?" The casual voice stung, a blatant display of racial prejudice that cut through Marcus's composure. The casualness of the slur was more offensive than a direct insult. It was a casual dismissal, a complete disregard for his status and profession. It was a clear indication that this wasn't about security. It was about something far more sinister. Marcus felt his blood pressure rising. He had dealt with difficult patients, demanding family members, and even the occasional disgruntled colleague, but this was different. This wasn't a matter of professional disagreement. This was a blatant display of racism, a hateful assertion of power. He remained calm, though his patience was wearing thin. He was a surgeon, accustomed to precision and control, but his carefully cultivated composure was starting to fray at the edges. He was tired, and this was beyond unreasonable. He just wanted to go home. The air crackled with tension. Marcus stood his ground, his calm demeanor a thin veil over simmering anger. David's words, casually cruel, hung in the air like a noxious gas. The casual dismissal, the underlying prejudice, was a slap in the face, a stark reminder of the insidious racism that still permeated society, even within the seemingly sterile walls of a hospital. He'd faced microaggressions before, subtle slights and dismissive comments that chipped away at his spirit, but this was different. This was blatant, unapologetic hate. He opened his mouth to respond, to explain again, to try and reason with the man, but David cut him off. He took another step closer, his shadow engulfing Marcus, making him feel trapped, cornered. The scent of David's cheap cologne, a sharp, cloying smell, filled Marcus's nostrils, adding to the growing sense of unease. I said, "What are you doing here?" David repeated, his voice a low growl, the casualness gone, replaced by a menacing tone. His hand hovered near his belt, a subtle but clear suggestion of force. The casual racism had transformed into a threat. Marcus felt a cold dread creeping into his heart. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate confrontation. Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline, a primal instinct to defend himself. He'd spent years honing his surgical skills, his hands trained to perform delicate operations with unwavering precision. But this wasn't a surgical field. This was a parking lot, and the weapons were not scalpels and forceps, but fists and anger. He had to remain calm, to avoid escalating the situation. He knew that any aggressive response would only justify David's actions and potentially lead to a far worse outcome. "I told you I work here," Marcus said, his voice firm but controlled, his hands remaining at his sides. He tried to keep his tone even, to avoid any hint of fear or anger that might provoke David further. He repeated himself, hoping that clarity would break through the wall of prejudice. David's response was a sneer. "Yeah, right? And I'm the Queen of England. You're trespassing, boy. Get out of here before I call the cops." The casual use of boy, the dismissive tone, the blatant lie. It was a clear indication that this wasn't about security. It was about something far more sinister. It was a calculated act of aggression, fueled by hate and a misplaced sense of authority. Marcus felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He was a highly respected surgeon, a man who dedicated his life to saving lives, and he was being treated like a criminal, a trespasser, solely because of the color of his skin. The injustice was a bitter pill to swallow, a painful reminder of the systemic racism that continued to plague society. He tried one last time to reason with David. "I'm a doctor at this hospital. I just finished a surgery. I have my ID right here." He reached into his pocket, pulling out his identification card again, holding it up as if somehow that would make a difference. David didn't even look at it. He simply pushed Marcus backward, his hand making contact with Marcus's chest, sending him stumbling. The force of the shove was unexpected, brutal. Marcus stumbled back, his briefcase falling to the ground, the contents spilling onto the asphalt. The papers scattered, his meticulously organized schedule and patient files now a chaotic mess. He felt a sharp pain in his shoulder, the impact jarring his body. David's face twisted into a cruel grin. "Get out of here, nigger," he spat, the word a venomous projectile aimed at Marcus's heart. The casual racism had escalated into a violent assault. The hateful slur, the physical aggression, the blatant disregard for human dignity. It was a horrifying display of unchecked prejudice. The parking lot, once a quiet space, had transformed into a battleground of hate. Marcus's anger flared, but he knew he had to control it. He had to get out of there. He had to survive this. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Marcus's ears rang, the sound of David's hateful words echoing in his head. The pain in his shoulder throbbed, a sharp reminder of the physical assault. He knelt, gathering his scattered papers, his hands trembling slightly. The humiliation was a bitter taste in his mouth, a burning shame that threatened to consume him. He was a surgeon, a man of precision and control, and he had been reduced to a helpless victim, his dignity trampled under the heel of a racist security guard. He looked up, his eyes meeting David's. David stood over him, his face contorted in a mask of hatred, his body radiating menace. The casual racism had morphed into something far more sinister, a calculated act of violence fueled by prejudice and a misplaced sense of power. The man was a bully, a coward who hid behind his uniform and his position. Marcus felt a surge of anger, a righteous fury that threatened to boil over. But he held it back, his years of training kicking in, reminding him of the importance of self-control, of avoiding escalation. He knew that any aggressive response would only justify David's actions, potentially leading to a far worse outcome. He was in a vulnerable position, outnumbered, and any physical altercation could easily turn against him. He had to remain calm, to think clearly, to find a way out of this situation without further injury or confrontation. He had to survive this encounter. He stood slowly, his body aching, his hands still shaking. He avoided eye contact with David, focusing instead on gathering his scattered papers. He picked them up one by one, his movements slow and deliberate, a silent act of defiance against the chaos that David had inflicted. He didn't want to give the man the satisfaction of seeing him react, of witnessing his anger or fear. As he gathered his belongings, he noticed several people watching from a distance, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. They were witnesses to the assault, silent observers who had witnessed the blatant racism and the unwarranted violence. Their presence offered a glimmer of hope, a silent promise of accountability. He knew that someone had seen what had happened, that someone would remember the details, and that perhaps, someday, justice would be served. He finished gathering his papers, carefully placing them back into his briefcase. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on the ground. He didn't want to look at David, didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing his pain or his humiliation. He didn't want to give him the power to define this moment. He turned and walked away, his steps slow and deliberate, each footfall a quiet act of resistance. He didn't look back, didn't give David the satisfaction of seeing his retreat. He walked towards his car, his body aching, his spirit wounded, but his resolve unbroken. He would not let David's hate define him. He would not let this incident diminish his worth or his accomplishments. He would survive this, and he would move on. He would find a way to heal, both physically and emotionally. But first, he needed to get away from this place, away from David's hateful presence. He needed to escape the shadow of his prejudice. The drive home was a blur. Marcus barely registered the familiar streets, his mind replaying the events of the parking lot, the sting of David's words, and the force of his shove still fresh in his memory. The anger simmered beneath the surface, a dangerous current threatening to overwhelm him. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched tight. He wanted to lash out, to confront David, to demand an apology, but he knew that wouldn't solve anything. It would only escalate the situation, potentially leading to further conflict. He had to remain calm, to control his emotions, to find a way to process the trauma without resorting to violence. He pulled into his driveway, the quiet of his suburban street a stark contrast to the chaos he'd just experienced. He parked the car, switched off the engine, and sat for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He felt the throbbing pain in his shoulder, a constant reminder of the physical assault, but it was the emotional wounds that ran deeper, the sting of racism, the humiliation of being unjustly accused and violently attacked. He got out of the car, his movements stiff and slow. He walked to the front door, his key fumbling in his hand. He unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind him, the familiar comfort of his home offering a small measure of solace. He switched on the lights, illuminating the quiet space, the warmth of the interior a stark contrast to the cold hostility he'd just encountered. He went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and drank it slowly, trying to calm his racing heart. He needed to process what had happened, to understand why David had reacted so violently, so hatefully. It wasn't just about security. It was about something far deeper, something far more sinister. It was about prejudice, about ingrained biases, about the systemic racism that continued to plague society. He sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, trying to make sense of it all. The incident was a painful reminder of the subtle and not-so-subtle ways in which racism manifested itself in daily life, a constant threat that lurked beneath the surface of polite society. He'd always been aware of the racism that existed in the world, but this incident had brought it into sharp focus, a stark reminder of the challenges and injustices that still needed to be addressed. He thought about the witnesses, the people who had watched from a distance, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. Their presence had offered a glimmer of hope, a silent promise of accountability. He knew that someone had seen what had happened, that someone would remember the details, and that perhaps, someday, justice would be served. But that didn't erase the pain, the humiliation, the anger. He needed to find a way to cope, to heal, to move on. He stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the quiet street. The darkness offered a sense of anonymity, a temporary escape from the harsh reality of what had just happened. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart, trying to regain control of his emotions. He knew that he couldn't let David's hate define him, couldn't let this incident diminish his worth or his accomplishments. He would survive this, and he would move on. He would find a way to heal, both physically and emotionally. But first, he needed some time to process the trauma, to come to terms with what had happened. He needed to find a way to move forward, to reclaim his sense of self, to regain his sense of peace. He would not let David win. The following hours were a blur of restless activity. Marcus couldn't sit still, couldn't relax. The adrenaline still coursed through his veins, a constant reminder of the assault. He tried to work, to lose himself in the complexities of a medical journal. But his mind kept wandering back to the parking lot, to David's hateful words, to the searing pain of the shove. He paced his apartment, his steps echoing in the quiet space, his frustration growing with each passing moment. He tried to call his wife, but hesitated. He didn't want to burden her with his problems, didn't want to worry her unnecessarily. She had enough on her plate, juggling her own demanding career and their busy lives. He knew she would be supportive, would offer comfort and understanding. But he also knew that she would be angry, would want to take action, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that yet. He needed time to process his emotions, to figure out how he wanted to proceed. He considered going to the police, reporting the assault, but again, he hesitated. He knew that filing a report wouldn't necessarily bring justice, wouldn't necessarily change anything. The system was often slow, cumbersome, and frustrating, and he wasn't sure he had the energy to navigate that process. Plus, a part of him feared the potential backlash, the possibility of being further victimized, of facing further discrimination. He knew that reporting the incident could open him up to further scrutiny, further harassment. He checked his phone repeatedly, hoping for a call, a message, anything that might offer a sense of resolution, a sense of closure. But there was nothing. The silence was deafening, a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside him. He felt isolated, alone in his anger and frustration. He was a successful surgeon, a respected member of the community, and yet he felt powerless, vulnerable, exposed. He walked to the window again, looking out at the darkening sky. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a distant, almost mocking reminder of the normalcy that he was currently unable to access. He felt disconnected, adrift in a sea of anger and frustration. He longed for a sense of normalcy, a return to the quiet rhythm of his daily life. But he knew that wouldn't be possible until he dealt with the trauma, until he found a way to process his emotions. He thought about his patients, the people he'd dedicated his life to helping, the lives he'd saved. He thought about the trust they placed in him, the faith they had in his abilities. He knew that he couldn't let this incident derail his career, couldn't let it diminish his commitment to his profession. He had to find a way to move forward, to regain his sense of purpose, to reclaim his sense of self. He decided to take a walk, to clear his head, to try and find some peace. He put on his coat, stepped out into the cool night air, and started walking, his steps slow and deliberate. He walked for hours, the rhythmic movement helping to calm his racing thoughts. He walked until he felt exhausted, until the anger began to subside, until he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of resilience. He knew that he would get through this, that he would find a way to heal, both physically and emotionally. He would not let David win. He would not let hate define him. He would not let this incident break him. He would survive. He would heal. He would continue. The insistent ringing of the phone jolted Marcus from a restless sleep. He'd finally managed to drift off, exhausted but still agitated, the events of the previous evening replaying in his mind like a broken record. He fumbled for the phone on his nightstand, his hand shaking slightly as he answered. "Hello," he mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. "Dr. Johnson? This is Dr. Ramirez from the ER. We have a critical patient, a young girl, Lily Davis. She's been in a serious accident, and we need you immediately." The doctor's voice was urgent, strained, filled with a desperate hope that only a life-or-death situation could inspire. The words hung in the air, a jarring contrast to the quiet peace of his bedroom. The urgency in Dr. Ramirez's voice pierced through the fog of his exhaustion, instantly replacing the lingering anger and frustration with a stark, chilling reality. A young girl, critically injured, needed his help. His professional instincts kicked in, overriding the lingering trauma of the previous evening. He was a surgeon. This was what he did. He was trained for this. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, he replied, his voice regaining its usual calm, professional tone. He swung his legs out of bed, the cold floor a shock against his bare feet. He quickly dressed, his movements efficient and precise, his mind already racing through the possible scenarios, the potential complications. He had to focus, had to concentrate, had to put the events of the previous evening aside, at least for now. He had a life to save. The drive to the hospital was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The lingering anger and frustration from his encounter with David Ward, with the urgency of the situation, the desperate need to save a young life. He tried to focus on the task at hand, to prepare himself mentally and emotionally for the challenge ahead, but the memory of David's hateful words and the brutal shove still lingered, a dark cloud hanging over the bright urgency of his professional duty. He arrived at the hospital, the familiar scent of antiseptic and disinfectant a stark reminder of his professional life. He rushed to the ER, his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He found Dr. Ramirez, who quickly briefed him on the situation. Lily Davis, a 10-year-old girl, had been involved in a serious car accident. She had suffered severe head trauma and internal injuries, and her condition was critical. As Dr. Ramirez explained the details, Marcus noticed a familiar figure standing near the nurse's station. It was David, the security guard who had assaulted him just hours earlier. He stood there, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. The sight of him, in this context, was jarring, a strange and unexpected twist in the unfolding drama. The man who had just hours earlier unleashed his hateful prejudice on Marcus now stood on the precipice of losing his own daughter. The irony was not lost on Marcus. The weight of the situation, the convergence of personal trauma and professional duty, pressed down on him with a crushing force. He had to focus. He had a life to save. And that life was inextricably linked to the man who had just tried to destroy his own. The operating room was a sterile, brightly lit sanctuary, a world apart from the chaotic urgency of the ER. The air hummed with the low thrum of sophisticated machinery, the rhythmic beeping of monitors a constant reminder of the delicate balance between life and death. Marcus scrubbed in, his movements precise and efficient, his mind focused entirely on the task at hand. He pushed aside the lingering anger and frustration, the memory of David's hateful words and the brutal shove, burying them deep beneath the layers of his professional expertise. This was not the time for personal feelings. This was a life-or-death situation, and he had to be at his best. The surgical team assembled around him, a symphony of coordinated movements and quiet efficiency. They worked as one, a well-oiled machine, each member playing their part in the intricate dance of life-saving surgery. Marcus led the way, his hands steady and precise, his mind sharp and focused. He guided the team through the delicate procedures, his years of training and experience guiding his every move. The surgery was long and complex, a grueling test of skill and endurance. Hours passed in a blur of focused concentration, the rhythmic beeping of the monitors a constant reminder of the fragility of life. Marcus worked tirelessly, his hands never faltering, his mind never wavering. He was in his element, his professional expertise taking over, pushing aside the lingering trauma of the previous evening. He was a surgeon, and this was what he did. He saved lives. As the surgery progressed, Marcus noticed David watching from the observation window, his face a mask of anxiety and fear. He stood there, a silent observer, his presence a stark reminder of the bizarre convergence of events, the unexpected intersection of personal animosity and professional duty. The man who had just hours earlier unleashed his hateful prejudice on Marcus now stood on the precipice of losing his own daughter, his life hanging in the balance, dependent on the very man he had attacked. The irony was not lost on Marcus, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. The tension in the operating room was palpable. Each suture, each incision, each carefully placed instrument was a testament to the skill and dedication of the surgical team. They worked tirelessly, their movements precise and efficient, their focus unwavering. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors continued, a constant reminder of the delicate balance between life and death. The air crackled with anticipation, the silence broken only by the soft whirring of the surgical instruments and the occasional murmured instruction. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the surgery was complete. Marcus stepped back, his body aching, his mind exhausted, but his spirit buoyed by the successful completion of a complex and challenging procedure. He had saved Lily's life. He had done his job. He had fulfilled his professional duty. But the weight of the situation, the strange and unsettling convergence of events, still lingered, a heavy cloud hanging over the successful outcome. He had saved the daughter of the man who had just hours earlier tried to destroy him. The implications of that fact were profound, unsettling, and yet strangely hopeful. The night was far from over. The waiting room was a crucible of emotions. David sat hunched in a chair, his face pale and drawn, his eyes red and swollen from lack of sleep and suppressed anxiety. He hadn't moved since the surgery began, his body rigid, his mind consumed by a torrent of fear and uncertainty. He watched the clock, each tick a hammer blow against his already frayed nerves. He'd been pacing for hours, his mind a whirlwind of regret and desperation. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden of guilt and self-recrimination. He hadn't slept since the accident, the image of his daughter's lifeless body seared into his memory. The frantic call, the terrifying rush to the hospital, the desperate pleas for help, it all played on repeat in his mind, a horrifying loop of fear and regret. He'd been a fool, a racist, a bigot, and now his daughter's life hung in the balance, dependent on the very man he had so unjustly attacked. The hours had stretched into an eternity, each minute an agonizing test of his endurance. He'd watched the surgical team come and go, their faces grim and determined, their movements precise and efficient. He'd seen the worried faces of the nurses, the hushed whispers of the doctors, the silent prayers of the family members. He'd felt the cold dread creep into his heart, the chilling realization that he might lose his daughter, that his hateful actions might cost him everything. The door to the operating room finally opened, and Marcus emerged, his face weary but resolute. He looked directly at David, his gaze steady and unwavering. There was no anger in his eyes, no trace of resentment, only a quiet, professional weariness. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the shared experience, the unspoken understanding that transcended their recent conflict. David stood up, his legs shaky, his body trembling. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was speechless, overwhelmed by a torrent of emotions: fear, regret, remorse, gratitude. He wanted to apologize, to beg for forgiveness, but the words seemed to catch in his throat. He felt a lump forming in his throat, his eyes welling up with tears. Marcus spoke first, his voice calm and measured. "Your daughter is going to be okay." The surgery was successful. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken emotions. They were a lifeline, a beacon of hope in the darkness of David's despair. David's body visibly relaxed. The tension that had gripped him for hours began to dissipate, replaced by a wave of overwhelming relief. He let out a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping, his body finally yielding to the exhaustion that had been building within him. He wanted to thank Marcus, to express his gratitude, but the words still eluded him. Marcus continued, "She's stable, but she'll need a lot of rest and recovery. You can see her in a few hours." He paused, then added, "I'm glad she's going to be all right." The words were simple, yet they held a depth of meaning that transcended the professional context. They were a gesture of compassion, a silent acknowledgement of the shared humanity that bound them together, despite their recent conflict. David finally found his voice, his words choked with emotion. I don't know what to say." His voice cracked, his eyes brimming with tears. I'm so sorry." The apology was heartfelt, raw, unburdened by the hateful prejudice that had fueled his earlier actions. It was a genuine expression of remorse, a desperate plea for forgiveness. Marcus simply nodded, his gaze unwavering. He understood. He knew the weight of David's regret, the depth of his remorse. He had seen the fear in his eyes, the desperation in his posture. He had witnessed the transformation, the shedding of hate, the embrace of humility. He had witnessed the beginning of redemption. The hours that followed were a blur of anxious waiting. David paced the waiting room, his eyes darting towards the nurse's station every few seconds, his hands clasped tightly together, his body tense with a mixture of hope and fear. He couldn't sit still, couldn't relax. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a crushing burden of guilt and self-recrimination. He replayed the events of the past 24 hours in his mind, the hateful words, the brutal shove, the horrifying accident, the life-saving surgery. He was consumed by a torrent of regret, a deep sense of shame. He thought about Marcus, the man he had so unjustly attacked, the man who had saved his daughter's life. The irony was not lost on him. The man he had treated with such contempt, such hate, was now the one responsible for his daughter's survival. He was overwhelmed by a sense of gratitude, a profound appreciation for the compassion and skill that had saved Lily's life. He thought about his own prejudices, the ingrained biases that had fueled his actions. He had allowed his hate to cloud his judgment, to blind him to the humanity of the man he had attacked. He had allowed his assumptions, his stereotypes, to dictate his behavior, to lead him to commit an act of violence. He was ashamed of himself, disgusted by his own behavior. He knew that an apology wasn't enough, that his words couldn't undo the harm he had caused. He knew that he had to do more, that he had to make amends, that he had to take responsibility for his actions. He had to change. He had to become a better person. He had to learn to overcome his prejudices, to challenge his assumptions, to see the humanity in everyone, regardless of their race or background. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a nurse approached him. "Mr. Davis," she said, her voice soft and gentle. "You can see your daughter now." The words were a balm to his wounded soul, a beacon of hope in the darkness of his despair. He followed the nurse to Lily's room, his heart pounding in his chest. He entered the room cautiously, his steps slow and deliberate. Lily lay in bed, her eyes closed, her face pale but peaceful. He approached her cautiously, his hand hovering over her arm. He gently touched her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin, the faint beat of her pulse. She was alive. She was safe. She was going to be okay. He sat beside her bed, watching her sleep, his heart filled with a mixture of relief and remorse. He felt a surge of love for his daughter, a profound appreciation for the preciousness of life. He knew that he had almost lost her, that his hateful actions had almost cost him everything. He was grateful for the second chance, grateful for the opportunity to make amends, grateful for the compassion and skill of the man he had so unjustly attacked. He spent hours sitting beside Lily's bed, watching her sleep, his heart filled with a mixture of love, relief, and remorse. He knew that his journey to redemption would be long and difficult, but he was determined to make amends, to become a better person, to overcome his prejudices, and to live a life worthy of his daughter's love and forgiveness. He had been given a second chance, and he would not waste it. The following days were a blur of hospital visits, anxious waiting, and quiet reflection. David spent hours by Lily's bedside, watching over her, holding her hand, whispering words of love and reassurance. He felt a profound shift within himself, a transformation that went beyond simple remorse. The hate that had consumed him for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of empathy and understanding. He saw Lily's vulnerability, her dependence on him, and it triggered a profound shift in his perspective. He began to examine his own prejudices, the ingrained biases that had shaped his worldview for so long. He realized how easily his assumptions, his stereotypes, had led him to commit an act of violence, an act that could have cost him everything. He started to question the sources of his hate, the ingrained societal messages that had fueled his prejudice. He began to understand the insidious nature of racism, its subtle and not-so-subtle ways of manifesting itself in daily life. He started to read, to educate himself, to learn more about the history of racism, the systemic inequalities that still plague society. He devoured books and articles, seeking to understand the roots of his own prejudice, the ways in which societal structures had perpetuated discrimination. He began to see the world through a different lens, a lens that was less clouded by hate and more informed by empathy and understanding. He also started to think about Marcus, the man he had so unjustly attacked. He realized the depth of his own wrongdoing, the profound disrespect he had shown to another human being. He knew that an apology wasn't enough, that his words couldn't undo the harm he had caused. He felt a deep sense of shame, a profound regret for his actions. He wanted to reach out to Marcus, to express his gratitude, to apologize again, but he hesitated. He wasn't sure how Marcus would react, wasn't sure if he would even want to hear from him. He understood that forgiveness wasn't something he could demand, that it was something he had to earn. He began to make small changes in his life, subtle shifts in his behavior that reflected his growing understanding. He started to challenge his own biases, to question his assumptions, to treat everyone with respect, regardless of their race or background. He became more mindful of his language, more aware of his actions, more sensitive to the feelings of others. He started to engage in conversations about race and racism, seeking to understand different perspectives, to challenge his own preconceived notions. He joined a diversity and inclusion group at the hospital, actively participating in discussions and workshops. He became an advocate for change, a voice for equality and justice. He knew that his journey to redemption would be long and difficult, but he was determined to make amends, to become a better person, to overcome his prejudices, and to live a life worthy of his daughter's love and forgiveness. He had been given a second chance, and he would not waste it. He would dedicate his life to making up for his past mistakes, to becoming an agent of positive change in the world. He would use his experience to educate others, to promote understanding, and to combat racism wherever he found it. He would never forget the lesson he had learned, the profound impact of his actions, and the transformative power of compassion and empathy. Weeks turned into months. Lily recovered remarkably well, exceeding even the doctor's expectations. Her recovery was a testament to the skill of the surgical team and the power of human resilience. David watched her progress with a mixture of relief and wonder, his heart overflowing with gratitude. He spent countless hours by her bedside, reading to her, playing games with her, simply being present, cherishing every moment. He was a changed man, his previous prejudices replaced by a deep appreciation for life and a profound sense of responsibility. He continued his journey of self-reflection and growth. He actively participated in diversity and inclusion initiatives at the hospital, sharing his story with colleagues and patients, becoming a powerful advocate for change. His transformation was remarkable, a testament to the power of personal experience and the potential for growth and redemption. He'd also started attending regular therapy sessions, working through the trauma of the incident, confronting his past prejudices, and developing healthier coping mechanisms. He learned to identify and challenge his own biases, to recognize the subtle ways in which racism manifested itself in his thoughts and actions. He learned to listen to others, to empathize with their experiences, and to see the world through a more nuanced and inclusive lens. One day, he saw Marcus in the hospital cafeteria. He hesitated, unsure of how to approach him, unsure of how Marcus would react. He'd been dreading this moment, anticipating rejection, anticipating anger. But he knew he had to do it, had to express his gratitude, had to apologize again, this time with a deeper understanding of the gravity of his actions. He took a deep breath and approached Marcus, his heart pounding in his chest. "Dr. Johnson," he said, his voice trembling slightly. Marcus looked up, his expression unreadable. David braced himself for rejection, for anger, but instead, Marcus simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of their shared history. I wanted to thank you again," David stammered, his voice choked with emotion, "for saving Lily's life. I know I don't deserve it after what I did." He paused, his eyes welling up with tears. "I'm truly sorry for my actions. I was wrong, and I'm working hard to change." Marcus listened patiently, his gaze steady and unwavering. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes, simply listened, allowing David to express his remorse. When David finished, Marcus simply said, "I'm glad Lily's okay." It was a simple statement, yet it held a depth of meaning that transcended the words themselves. It was an acknowledgement of David's remorse, a recognition of his efforts to change, a gesture of forgiveness. They talked for a while, sharing a quiet meal, a conversation that transcended their past conflict, a conversation that spoke of shared humanity, of the potential for growth and redemption. They talked about Lily's recovery, about the importance of empathy and understanding, about the need to challenge prejudice and promote equality. It was a conversation that marked a turning point, a moment of reconciliation, a testament to the power of forgiveness and the possibility of healing. It was the start of an unlikely friendship, a bond forged in the crucible of adversity, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Months later, the hospital held a small, private ceremony to honor its staff for their exceptional contributions during the past year. Lily, now fully recovered, was there, a vibrant and healthy 10-year-old, a testament to the skill and dedication of the medical team. David, his face etched with a newfound serenity, stood proudly beside her, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on Marcus, who stood across the room, a quiet observer of the proceedings. The ceremony was a celebration of life, of resilience, of the transformative power of human connection. It was a recognition of the extraordinary efforts of the medical staff, their unwavering commitment to saving lives, their dedication to healing. But it was also a celebration of David's transformation, a testament to his journey of self-reflection, his commitment to growth, his dedication to making amends. He watched as Marcus was called to the stage to receive an award for his exceptional surgical skills and his unwavering commitment to patient care. Marcus accepted the award with his usual quiet grace, but this time, there was a hint of something else in his eyes, a quiet pride, a sense of satisfaction that went beyond professional accomplishment. After the ceremony, David approached Marcus again, this time with a newfound confidence. He wanted to share his story more widely, to use his experience to promote understanding and combat racism. He'd already started speaking at local community events, sharing his story with anyone who would listen. He'd become an advocate for change, a voice for equality and justice. He asked Marcus if he would be willing to share his story publicly as well, to help raise awareness about the insidious nature of racism and the importance of challenging prejudice. He knew that Marcus's story, combined with his own, would have a powerful impact. He knew that together, they could make a difference. Marcus agreed. He understood the importance of using their shared experience to promote positive change. He knew that their story, a story of hate and healing, of conflict and reconciliation, could inspire others to challenge their own biases, to confront their own prejudices, to work towards a more just and equitable world. They began to speak publicly, sharing their stories at community events, conferences, and schools. Their message resonated deeply with audiences, inspiring reflection, challenging assumptions, and promoting understanding. Their story became a symbol of hope, a testament to the transformative power of forgiveness and the potential for growth and redemption. Their joint appearances became a powerful symbol of reconciliation, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They showed the world that even in the face of hatred and prejudice, compassion and empathy could prevail. Their story became a beacon of hope, inspiring others to challenge their own biases and work towards a more just and equitable world. It was a story of hate and healing, of conflict and reconciliation, a story that would continue to inspire for years to come. It was a story that proved that even from the deepest darkness, the light of hope could shine through.